Welcome to the CXO and CHRO Walk into a Bar, where we share insights at the intersection of talent and revenue. Dive into a unique narrative with our hosts, Michelle Strasburger, the insightful CHRO, and Dominique Sanfleur, the visionary CXO. Together, they bring dynamic perspectives that ignite thought-provoking dialogue from the C-suite. Each week, join us for electrifying sessions that confront the very challenges modern CXOs navigate in today's fast-paced business landscape. When split-second decisions loom, must it be talent or revenue that takes the hit? Or is there a harmonious crossroad where both can thrive? Can we blur the lines between talent and revenue? In every episode, we provide executive leaders with 3 strategic takeaways, transformative insights that will propel you to master the delicate balance between people and profit. It's not about winners or losers, but crafting an environment where everyone triumphs. Tune in and step closer to redefining executive success.
Here we are.
Oh, I think I say this every Thursday, but I can't believe it's Thursday.
It part of it is, we took a break last week, and so, maybe it's going by faster because we're not keeping that cadence with now we're back to our cadence, but we did miss you last week, or I hope the audience missed us last week. So
yes, it's good to be back. It was nice to take a little break, but it's good to be back, and we're back with a good topic. We're talking about the blind spots that make the news. So so let's jump in. I'm Michelle Strasburger. I am the CEO of HR Rebooted. We work with CEOs to build intentional cultures so you can scale your organization without losing your soul.
Absolutely. And I'm Dominique Sanfleur, CEO of VentureMark. We create a data layer over an organization to help leaders identify hidden risks that get in the way of execution.
Blind spots. So I think there's been a lot in the news that I think sometimes people aren't expecting. And it was, I had a CEO once that was his barometer, right? I don't want to do something that is going to end up on the cover of New York Times. And that was always his barometer. Like, am I going to make a decision that's going to end up on the cover of the New York Times? And I think in today's world, it's worse than that. It's not even just the New York Times. It's in today's world with AI and social media, and things are just out there and in the public, and some things you can't control. And so how do you make sure that you are seeing those things and create? I think there's 2 parallel tracks, right? I think one is building a culture that these things are surfaced, right? We have a culture of trust and feedback. And then the other is, how do you listen to the organization so that they're coming up, right? And part of that is building that culture of feedback, but also kind of leaning in and listening. And when you and I were talking, and I posted it in the comments when I shared this, is that when you're an individual contributor, and we can all remember those times, right? Before we stepped into leadership roles, for anybody in a leadership role, like, you knew everything. You knew all the dirt. Everybody was talking. You were part of the club, right? You knew all the things. And then you got to a leadership role and everybody stopped talking to you. You did not know anything going on anymore. And it was like, what happened? And then you move into the executive roles, and the board is now looking at you and expecting you to have a pulse on the organization and to mitigate these risks. And then things blow up and they're like, why didn't you know that this was happening? Right. And so how do you deal with that?
Michelle, I think you hit on a few really good points. The first one was, everybody's a news reporter now, right? Because they have their phone and they have social media, right? So we're all surrounded by news reporters. Back in the day, it used to be, the news reporter would just call the phone and you could just kind of ignore it. But now everybody's a news reporter, and the distribution channels for information, good or bad, accurate or not accurate, is available to everybody. So we're definitely in a time where, PR is now a much more massive scope than it was, when you just had to worry about that one news reporter calling in, and you just tell your employees don't interact with the media. But now it's everybody's the media. Everybody's a reporter. So I think that's one big thing.
Even your
The second is
employees are like, we've seen
yep.
there was an employee who got terminated, and I don't remember the company name, but it went viral. She recorded the termination, and the termination was horrible, unfortunately. And they recorded the termination and then posted it everywhere, and that went viral. So even those conversations that used to be held behind closed doors are no longer being held behind closed doors.
Now we're in days where you have to assume there are no more closed doors, right? You have to kind of assume that, and you got to operate that way. And that's where integrity and culture is going to matter the most. But you hit on something else where, it's how do you listen and pick up on these things, especially as, you become leaders. People stop talking to you. And I think that's a great point that you raised, but yet you're still accountable for not knowing something. So it's like, exactly right. You're in a position where people don't want to talk to you anymore, about certain things, but you should have known. So I think that's a really good tension that you brought up. And I think it's going to be central to as we continue our discussion. Where shall we start? Why don't we define some of these risks, right? What do some of these risks look like, right? There are things that are happening now at your organization, right? No matter what leader you are, they're happening already. Now, what stops them from becoming a public issue is just one post away, right? It's a very thin margin. But what are some of these risks? What do they look like? What do they encompass? What's the scope?
Yeah, I think we can even start small, right? And say bad leadership, right? We talked about that termination. Bad leaders, bad, I hate to say it because I'm an HR person, but there are bad HR people, right? And so things are handled, situations that are handled poorly. When we do RIFs, when we do restructuring that are handled poorly, there's risks there. And when they're captured in a situation where it can become public, there's risks to the organization, and it can have risks to your reputation. It can have risks to your culture. And I think when you have bad leadership, that has a huge risk to your culture.
Bad leadership practices for sure, right? Mm-hmm. Because this could extend to even someone by traditional terms we considered a good leader, but had a bad practice or had a bad moment or had a bad, so I think leadership, bad leadership practices. One that comes to mind is, things that are out of policy, but also touch on kind of moral implications, or, that kind of blur the line. Like, yes, it's definitely not, part of company policy, but it could be interpreted, in moral situations as well, right? Things like fraud or like, a scandal, unsanctioned relationship between, a supervisor and a subordinate. I think those things also are they kind of touch the line where they're really susceptible to moral judgment, right? Mm-hmm. And that kind of adds motivation for people to post it and get it out there, right? When people could kind of say, look, you're supposed to be a leader, but look what you allowed happen, or something like that. If people can point fingers, that's extra motivation for information to be distributed. What are your thoughts there? Anything to?
I also think, like, on that note, I think like bullying and harassment too can get a lot of attention, because it's also that personal attack. And it's that, you've hurt me, you've hurt a friend, you've hurt somebody that I know, and that can go out virally as well.
100%. These,
And a lot
yeah.
of times it's not just the person that's doing it that knows it happened, or the person that's a victim that knows it's happened. A lot of other people know what's going on, but maybe leadership doesn't, or other leaders don't know what's happening, right? Because sometimes we can sit with our tunnel vision on and not know what's going on.
And Michelle, to that point, right? It's like these are things that are happening in pretty much every organization, right? And really great point on someone apart from the people who are directly involved also know, right? It's kind of hard to keep information siloed. Whispers are happening, people know, and the information's there, but it doesn't, kind of leads into, why are these things missed, right? If other people know, what keeps that information from making it to the necessary people that need to know to intervene and make the right decisions? I think sometimes it could be lack of trust with leadership, right? If an employee knows about something that's happening between or with another employee or between other employees, they want to keep their name out of it, right? They don't want to be pulled into a situation and be in the middle. So there's that, right? Like, how can I, and am I motivated enough as an employee to even anonymously let leadership know, right? Like, do I care enough, right? Is there a culture that's created where I care enough about the organization, what's going on, that I'm going to go out my way to give someone a heads up? So there's that lack of motivation, or that comes from that lack of trust, where other people may know, but it doesn't make it to leadership because there's that lack of trust or buy-in from folks that may know.
I think there's also fear, right? Like, you don't know what's going to happen after you report it. Is that person going to come after you? I had an employee once when I was working at a company where there was another employee who was committing fraud, and this employee came into my office and said, I don't know what this person's capable of. And I'm afraid that if they're committing this, like, what else could they do? And could they harm me or my family? So I want to tell you this is going on, but I don't want my name put into it. I don't want to be involved. And I actually don't want to be part of it. And so we actually put that person on a leave of absence while we did an investigation. So they were removed, and we actually we just did like this investigation, never brought that person's name into it, in order to keep to keep them safe, because they were just afraid of not the repercussions from leadership, but the repercussions from this other person. They were actually afraid, like, if they didn't tell us, that they would lose their job. So there was a fear. There was fear that motivated them to tell us, but fear almost held them back from telling us as well.
That's a very interesting tension, right? Because because that's interesting, right? Because if something bad is happening, right? Who else? I think that's a very valid concern. What else is that person capable of? You don't know, right? And so that fear is a really big fear, and just like fear of getting involved or fear of repercussion from leadership being implicated. There's just a lot of that. So it would take quite a bit of motivation. In her case, right, it was like, I need to tell you, because if I don't tell you, that's going to, that potentially may impact my job.
Happen. Yeah. Right. In other areas.
But I wonder how many other things that are happening at an organization where that similar level of motivation doesn't exist, but similar barriers do, right? All those other barriers do most of the time, but that similar level of motivation to get someone to come forward oftentimes may not.
I also think too, if it's a leader doing it, sometimes employees feel like everybody must know that the leader is doing it and they're getting away with it. And so there's no need to report it because everybody must know. And so I think that's why it's so important for leaders to lean in and listen and ask questions. And I'm going to put you on the spot, Dominique, because I think this is where what your organization does at Intramark is really important, because you have a product that, and this isn't supposed to be a sales call, but I'm gonna turn it into one for a minute. That can do something like this and ask questions and probe people in a way that makes them feel comfortable and listen kind of at the fringes, as you say, without making people feel like they're at risk or, that they're going to get fired if they speak up or things like that, but they can arm leaders and executives with information that they might not have otherwise.
You hit it on the head. It's where organizations like mine thrive, right? Is being able to broker that information, where employees or people who may not be in power feel safe, providing that information. That's very valuable to leadership, but that kind of keeps explicitly keeps that barrier and that contractual trust, if you will, intact, so that information continues to flow. And that's very, very important. And I'd love to jump into these things exist. They're getting missed. How do we avoid them not getting missed, right? And I think systems like Vibe, for what we do with Intramark, is definitely a solution, right? We're having a process that listens at the edges, surfaces information, looks at patterns, and really brings it up to leadership in a way that maintains that trust with employees who are providing this very valuable information that helps leadership get ahead of some of these issues. Then folks like you can jump in and really help leaders navigate those tricky situations, and really think through a very strategic way of going about resolving these challenges. And so, that's definitely one way. Any other ways that you could think of? Is there or what are some other tactics that a leader could start thinking of to pick up on some of these signals?
Yeah, I think you have to be in it. I think you have to be visible. I think you have to ask questions, and ask them often. And to create a culture of feedback, you have to be able to give feedback, and you have to be able to receive feedback. And if an employee comes to you with a concern, you have to listen, and you have to respond in a way that makes them feel heard, and not respond in a way that gives them excuses. So a lot of times, it's hard to hear feedback, right? And it's hard, and it's hard to hear something about somebody on your team that you really respect and you trust. And so it could be, did you maybe mishear that? Did you maybe not think about, maybe they were just busy or running late, or maybe that stuff doesn't matter. When somebody's giving feedback, their best response is to say, thank you, I will take that, and I will look into it. And looking into it is important, because even if it's false, or even if it's just the loudest employee that complains all the time, there might be a nugget there, right? Sometimes a lot of people complain to that employee because they are the ones that are willing to complain. And so those people have the inside scoop and the information. And so hearing them out and listening to that is important. If somebody comes into your office and says, hey, I need to share something with you, and you attack them or you give them excuses, they will never, ever, ever come back to you and give you that feedback again. So, but if they come in and you say, wow, Dominique, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I know that took a lot of effort. I really appreciate it. I will look into it and get back to you. And the same thing with using a product like Vibe. If you're going to get the information, you're going to get the feedback, there has to be an opportunity to close the loop and say, we heard you, we got this information, here's what we're doing about it, and here's the change we're doing. And the more you do that, the more you're going to open those doors so that people feel comfortable talking to you and raising the issues. And initially the issues will be small, right? But if the big issue comes up, they're going to feel more comfortable raising it.
Michelle, you hit it on the head, right? What popped into my mind was, if you as a leader can develop a reputation of someone who takes bad news well, people are going to start trusting you with the small bad news. Then people are going to continue trusting you with the bigger bad news. The problem with a lot of leadership dynamics or organizational dynamics is people don't want to be the messenger. They don't want to be the one delivering the bad news. They don't want to give bad news. So they massage the information. They do whatever they need to make it sound softer or not as bad as it really is. And there's miscommunication. And then you have layers of that happening, right? You have positioning, massaging. The higher up the information goes, because the next person up, they want to kind of massage it. And so you have something that starts off as red that ends up being purple, but is really red, and should be, presented as such to the leader that can act on it. But that leader probably has three other things that they think is red and this purple thing. And so they kind of deprioritize that when it's actually the super bright flashing red thing. But I think, to your point, is how do you as a leader start developing that reputation of, I can take bad news, and then people are going to test it. And if people can trust you with some bad news, more can come through, unencumbered. And I think that's a big thing, is that a lot of people, and rightfully so, perceive that certain leaders can't take bad news well, or bad feedback well, or whatever the bad news may be. It doesn't need to be bad news about them specifically, but just bad news in general, without having an explosive reaction or an unpredictable reaction or a negative reaction. Being a leader that takes that bad news, works on it, has a constructive way of working forward and being transparent of how it's being worked through. You'll get that in small doses, and then you'll get the important stuff when they come up early, which will make the difference between whether or not you hit an iceberg or not. And sometimes it's really that thin margin of information that can make the difference for a lot of organizations. But great point. And I think
it's important that it needs to be owned by leadership. I think HR can give you the tools and the coaching to do it, but it really needs to be something that's owned by leadership. Culture is a strategic initiative that's really owned by the CEO and by the leadership. So it needs to be something that is just not pushed on HR. Like, go figure out the feedback and let me know, right? It needs to be something that is practiced every day in leadership.
And I think professionals like you, Michelle, right, fractional CHROs, chief people officers, having that external perspective, right? Because what tends to happen, and whenever we're working on a project or whatever it is, we're so in it that we sometimes don't see clearly from an outside perspective. But occasionally, or more than occasionally, bringing in professionals like you to have that fresh outsider perspective, what they're seeing from the market, bringing it into that organization, as an advisor to leaders and HR teams, extremely essential, right? So the way I'm thinking about fractional chief people officers is bring them in as advisors so that you have that fresh perspective. You're checking, kind of like that litmus check of your assumptions, and bring them in with that fresh perspective so that you can navigate some of these tricky situations. Don't assume. I think leaders shouldn't always assume that they have all the answers, nor are they required to. Right, bringing in people strategically to have that fresh perspective is super, super valuable.
Mm-hmm. It's huge. And especially if you're doing any kind of engagement survey, having an outsider take that on and look at the data and say, here are the key challenges. Because it's so easy to look at it internally and be like, oh, that's just Susie. She's just not happy. But when that stuff goes out to social media, you can't respond to social media on Twitter and say, oh, it's just Susie. She's not happy.
Nope.
That ship has sailed. So you really need to kind of get rid of that excuse and really look at it from a fresh lens of like, no, this was more than just Susie. This is a common thread in the organization. There is a challenge here that we need to look at, and there is a cultural blip or something, or a break happening here, and let's dig in a little bit deeper and figure out what it is.
And that's how patterns start, right? Patterns start as blips. And wouldn't it be great to catch it when it's a blip versus when it's a pattern, right? Because pattern indicates more people are involved. It's happening, more frequently over time. which is not where, ideally you want something, right? You want to catch blips, and be strategic about which blip is just noise or which blip is potentially a bigger issue. There was something else I was going to say too, but you got it covered.
I think at the executive level too, it's hard, right? We're sitting here being like, you have to listen to your employees and lean in and blah, blah, blah. I think, when you get to like a 5,000 employee head count, it's not always easy to do that. So I think from that standpoint, and sometimes even startups, so you're moving fast, and maybe not startups, SMB markets, you're moving very fast, and you might not be able to have that touch point all the time. I think the executive leaders need to really empower their leaders to have these conversations and empower them to give feedback and receive feedback, and practice that with their leaders and their leadership teams, and ask the tough questions like, where are the blind spots? What are we missing? Right? And ask the tough questions and be open to the feedback so that they can then ask the questions in their teams. Like, what are we missing? What are we not seeing? What are the blockers? What's the friction? We talked about that in one of our calls. Where's the friction? Right? Because sometimes friction's happening because there's something askew.
And it's really tough as you scale and more noise is being created because external market factors have an impact on the organization as well, right? As a leader, you're dealing with external issues, internal issues. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of activity, a lot of movement, growth, a lot to keep track of, metrics, people. And I, thank you for having that sympathy for leaders as well, right? Where or empathy for leaders, because it's not an easy job trying to get all these factors right? There's quite a bit of pressure. And sometimes, I could think through my days as an employee, sometimes there's not a lot of, sympathy or as much sympathy for leaders in the jobs that they have, because we're just like, that's why they get, paid the big bucks, and that's what they do. But it's not an easy job, and they need tools and systems to build that trust with employees. And to your point, it's hard if it's just one leader that's trying to push. So they need buy-in with other leaders, and they need to be able to scale this, right? They need to be able to, keep a pulse on the organization in a very scalable fashion that helps them, get the real story rather than things that are massaged, quite a bit. And so that empowerment should help everybody who's involved, not just the leader. But yeah.
I also think there's a question too of what happens when it's your top leaders that are being the risk creators, right? Your CEO. We saw this in the news recently, right? With Astronomer, your CEO, nobody's going to call him out and say something's not right here. And so how does the board or other stakeholders, how do they handle that? How would they have found a risk like that before it hits the news?
Yeah,
that's a tough one. I think ensuring that the board has a strong relationship with others at the executive level is important, and having that same kind of feedback cadence, I think, is important. I also think having an ethics hotline, no matter what stage of organization you're in, and having the ethics hotline pretty well known, and that people are comfortable calling in. I don't know how many people use an ethics hotline, but having it readily accessible so that when these things happen, again, this is really trying to catch it before it hits the news. So it's not really just having a tattletale system. It's really being able to find these blind spots before they happen. And this is, again, another situation where I think Vibe would be a great thing to use, where some of these things would have been uncovered, where somebody might feel a little bit more comfortable pointing at the CEO and saying, there's a problem here we need to address. And it could have been addressed quietly.
Yeah. And sometimes people try to, avoid addressing internal issues because it's uncomfortable, but at the expense of a much more expensive outcome, right? Or potential outcome. But you mentioned something as well, is like sometimes there's this like public knowledge, right? That people know, the rumors spread and people just kind of, there's not enough motivation for people to kind of report something in, it doesn't impact them directly. So it's not their business. People, will typically have a heads down approach to a lot of things. Right. And so the example that you mentioned, right, it certainly other people at the organization knew. But there's often a mass kind of knowledge, public knowledge that isn't reported, especially when the issue is the leader, right? That's a particular sticky situation because
putting your neck on the chopping block.
Not only that, but like you're potentially disrupting the organization. A lot can happen, right? So you don't want to be that person. That's, I'm not saying you shouldn't be that person. I'm just saying, the attitude sometimes is, especially when it involves a leader, there typically is a heads down, but could be a public knowledge of not so good that's happening, and those are tough to because who do you get that information to, right? Because anybody, even like an ethics hotline, right? It's going to a subordinate, right? And it could get blocked. Typically, it could get blocked anywhere in the chain, and like who's going to address it, right? If it's the main leader, especially, right? Like, are you going to tell the CEO to, who's going to be the one to tell the CEO to, you better behave? And so it's like, you get these very tricky situations, which is an interesting exploration. Is what perspectives do you have on that?
Yeah, I think that's where bringing in an outside advisor, right, to come in and look at the organization and figure out where the risks are. If you feel like there's something going on in the organization, to do an analysis within the organization and have that outside perspective is helpful. I think building a strong culture of feedback and having those reporting avenues and having those relationships with somebody they can go to, even if it's not the CEO, right? Who else would I go to, even if it's a problem with the CEO? Because it may not be a relationship. It could be fraud. It could be something worse. So we have to have channels in our organization to maintain the culture we want to maintain, and behavior can either help or hurt our culture. And so we need to make sure we have those things in place, even if it's the CEO.
And to your point, Michelle, having an outsider, looking in, sometimes could be the one to have that tough conversation with the CEO, for example, right? Where they're like, well, actually, the secret that you thought it was a secret is not a secret. And here's what here's what I would recommend you do to clean this up quietly or publicly, whatever it is, whatever the appropriate action is, but it gets cleaned up. Sometimes what's missing is that tough conversation with that specific leader to get that course corrected. And so I think that's when an outside advisor like yourself, or an outside system and process like Vibe, comes into play. That's super helpful.
Yeah, there needs to be accountability at all levels in the organization. And if you don't have that, that's when stuff goes outside the organization. And I would bet that anybody that's faced this externally would rather have dealt with it, as hard as it is, would rather have dealt with it internally in a safe environment versus out on social media. I would put money on that.
Oh, it's easy.
Yeah.
But it never feels that way in the moment, right? So I think that's typically
too, because now organizations have to do 10 times the damage control than they would have if it was something that they could manage internally and say, we found it, we've addressed it, and here's how we're going to move on, and we're going to move on together as a team. So versus having to do that publicly in addition to and do a public cleanup.
Yeah. It's a great conversation. It's a very, very important one, right? And I think these are risks that exist in most organizations, they just don't surface. And it's about how do we get to them quickly, manage them, and make, as they're still internal issues, and keep them there while being resolved thoroughly, right? Because you don't want that issue continuing. You're just spinning the hamster wheel. So, very, very good topic.
Yep, great topic. And I think this stuff starts to bubble outside of the organization when trust is not there, right? I mean, maybe there's not this last issue, but I think, when they're recording you, or when your employees are posting stuff on social media, it's because their trust is not there. And so building trust is a great place to start. And so I think that building trust and building a culture of feedback is a really great place to start, which is start listening to what's going on in your organization, listening to the heart of your organization.
Totally agree, Michelle. Totally agree.
Okay. Until next week.
Till next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Neha.
Thank you, Neha.
Bye, everyone.
You've just experienced another episode of The CXO and CHRO Walk into a Bar, where we share insights at the intersection of talent and revenue. Thank you for joining us. Please join us next week at noon Eastern for more strategic content to help you scale your business. You can follow us on LinkedIn and on YouTube for additional content or episodes you may have missed. The links will be in the comments section. If you'd like more information or to schedule time with Michelle or Dominique, follow the link in the comments section to book time on their calendar. Until next week, cheers.